The story of the West starts in the East. We have looked at Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Hebrew people, and now one last stop, we must, in a sense, mop up some other cultures that grew up in that eastern part of the world that have a significant legacy within Western tradition. There are actually six that we're going to quickly take a look at that are assembled under the term empire builders, in the sense that most of them build significant military empires that last less than a century or more, but they are like uh, uh, they pop up and disappear but leave behind important legacies that matter to Western tradition. Here is a quick list of the six we're going to be looking at, some just one slide or two, others a little more. They are, as we call them, the leftovers. The leftovers is simply a term to mean outside of the big three, the Mesopotamian people, the um, Egyptians, and the Hebrew people. There are these other six that we want to acknowledge before we move on to the two big roots of Western tradition, which are Greece and Rome. We want to quickly acknowledge the Hittites, the Phoenicians, the Assyrians, the Chaldeans or Neo-Babylonians, as they're called as well, the Lydians, and finally the Persians. And let's start with the Hittites. What we know now about the Hittites is a lot more than we used to know. Their kingdom was founded around the 18th century before Christ, and they grew to power within the areas that we call Turkey today, around the middle of the second millennium before Christ, and had a significant presence in that region for about 3 centuries. During their rise to power, they conquered areas that today are called Syria. They began to rival Egypt in the New Kingdom era of Egyptian pharaohs. And what we also know is that they collapsed quickly. Some scholars say not as quickly as once thought, but what is true is that we just can't quite define who brought them down. A mysterious sea peoples, a people that evidently came from the sea, whose origin is not clear at the present moment, brought down quickly. This is a fire that started up and quickly was extinguished, quickly in the sense of only a few centuries. That, of course, as compared to the Egyptian, which lasted 3,000 years. They will be notable during the time that they established their presence on the scene of history for developing ironworking significantly. In fact, they will help move ancient cultures out of the Bronze era, Bronze Age, into the Iron Age because of their notable abilities to deal with a much tougher, harder metal than bronze, which is iron. You're looking at a map of where now we can place the extension of the Hittite Empire to when it's at its grandest um, uh, extension. There was a time when their scholars questioned the existence of this empire, in spite of the fact that the Bible mentioned them very clearly. But now we have found significant ruins, German archaeological expeditions in the capital, which is Hattusha. If you're looking at the map, right in the middle, towards the top, you'll find what will be one of the major urban centers, the capital of the Hittite Empire during their years of expansion in the middle of the second millennium before Christ, in the area that today we call Turkey and Syria. The Hittites, they are a significant presence in the Middle East. In the middle of the second millennium before Christ, and they leave behind significant advancements in iron working. Number two are the Phoenicians. These are not warlike, these people, so very different. They're much more of a maritime, that is seagoing, merchant culture, traders. So in that sense, they are not like the Hittites before them, or definitely like the Assyrians that we will look at after that. They are traders, they are merchants, and they develop systems of navigation and ships and ability to navigate to far, far away places within the Mediterranean. Some say even outside of the Mediterranean, around the African coast, or even to the English islands, some say. Some say they reached Britain and even West Africa with their ability to sail the high seas. A reminder to you that in ancient times, especially when winter and the storms of winter came, there was no sailing because ships were not able to withstand the kind of storms at sea, and so the bottom of the Mediterranean is littered with those who did not manage to be respectful not only of the seasons of navigation, but also of the kind of storms that popped up out of nowhere. The Phoenicians evidently were able to do to navigate the seas and to chart the Mediterranean Sea far more than anybody else. For that reason, they're coastal. They live along the coast. And I'm going to show you a map of that in just a second. But I want to go ahead and highlight an important urban center, a city of the Phoenicians along the coast, what we call today Israel or Lebanon, and it's a city called Byblos. Byblos will give, of course, you can recognize the name to the term that we use now, Bible. This is where some of the early libraries there will surface, early library, and thus the word Bible comes from originally a Phoenician name for a city, their city along the coast. I'll show you that map where it is, and you will locate Byblos. They are inventors of the alphabet, as opposed to, say, the systems of writing that we've seen before, which were not syllabic or alphabetic, but they were more based upon images, so more pictographic. The alphabet as we have it today, for example, in the English language, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, when we put consonants and vowels together, we get a word. For example, H-O-U-S-E is just some consonants and vowels put together, but when we pronounce it, it says house, and when we say that word house, we have a picture that pops up in mind. House, the sound represents a picture, an item, a thing, a house. The concept of alphabet will originate with the Philistines in their language, while before languages were pictographic. They had a picture of a cow, more or less, or something like that. That's a bit simplistic, but that explains kind of the difference. Here's a map of where the Phoenicians will settle along the coast. See, notice just opposite the island of Cyprus in the Mediterranean. And there are several cities, some of which are still there today, but Tyre, Sidon, but please make note of about in the middle the city of Byblos, where from which the term Bible will come from. The third of the six empire builders is truly the scariest and the longest lasting of all these civilizations that pop up on the scene of history in this area of the world and then disappear later on, but leave behind some legacies. They are the largest of the empires we have looked at so far in the Near East. They come out of northern Mesopotamia, so the central part of the Fertile Crescent, if you remember that map, and they began to achieve independence in the 15th century before Christ, about the time that the Hittites are reaching their peak. The Assyrians achieved their independence, and then they began expanding. When the Hittites fall apart due to the invasions of the Sea People, they start expanding, and they expand with a highly specialized army and very different tactics. Their tactics are ruthless, sheer terror. They want to absolutely put fear in the enemy opponents, make them want to run, and so they use decapitation, literal, of their enemies, especially the rulers, and they use deportation. So they leave behind a scorched earth type policy, which leads many to not want to deal with the Assyrians and simply to fall under their domain before they are destroyed by them. You'll recall maybe the name Jonah. He is one of several Old Testament prophets, but he's the one that is told by God to go to Nineveh, the capital of the Assyrians, one of the great urban centers of the Assyrians, and he refuses to go because he, one, doesn't believe that they would convert to anything. Secondly, he believes that his preaching would be met by decapitation. They are the terrorists of ancient times. That narrative takes place in about the 8th century before Christ, when the Assyrians are still conquering and spreading terror within this part of the region. They peaked in the middle of the 7th century, so around 650 before Christ, and then because they got too large, overextension, they began to collapse by the late 7th century. So we come to the year, around the year 612, Assyria will be punished, will be overrun by the new kid on the block that we're about to examine in our next look. It is in 612 before Christ that the capital of Nineveh will fall to the next peoples that we're going to look at, which are the Chaldeans, or better known as the Babylonians, or better known as Neo-Babylonians, because there had been previously a Babylonian culture, but the one that punishes the Assyrians for their ruthlessness and destroys their capital of Nineveh in 612 are the Neo-Babylonians. The Neo-Babylonians rebelled. They had been under the ruthless domain of the Assyrians for centuries. They rebelled against Assyria. They captured Nineveh together with the Medes. So sometimes these people need to get credit too for bringing down the terrorists of ancient times, the Assyrians. In particular, the name Nebuchadnezzar II will be the king of the Neo-Babylonians that will rule the longest, over 40 years, and he will complete the conquest, even take Jerusalem, and will destroy it in 586, took Palestine, even spilled into Egypt, and Egyptian pharaohs had to deal with this new kid on the block called the Chaldeans, or Neo-Babylonians. But they enjoyed a period of prosperity, but not for long. Basically, this is truly a flame that flared up, and in after about 80 years was brought down by the next kid on the block, which are called the Persians. We'll talk about them at the end. This is a map of the Babylonian Empire at its greatest extension. So you see that the old Babylonian under Hammurabi was in the right side of the Fertile Crescent, but the new Babylonian Empire under the likes of Nebuchadnezzar around 580 BC expands to include the Arabian Desert, parts of the Arabian Desert, all of Palestine, and even parts of what we call Turkey today, or Asia Minor back then. So things left behind by the Neo-Babylonians and Nebuchadnezzar. The capital of Babylon will become, under Nebuchadnezzar, the Neo-Babylonian king, a great capital. He will fortify it, he will embellish it, and one of the most beautiful findings of archaeologists of this 6th century before Christ flame that shone brightly, but then was gone as fast as it appeared, was the gates to the goddess Ishtar. Ishtar was the goddess of love in the Babylonian pantheon of gods, and the Ishtar gates, and you see an image of it to the right in a museum, are beautiful gates. It used to be one of the gates of the entrance of the great city of Babylon of the early 6th century before Christ, with blue lapis lazuli, precious stone, walls covered in this. Absolutely beautiful. One of the myths, which probably was true, of Babylon, the great Babylon, were the hanging gardens built by Nebuchadnezzar, this beautiful forest up on upper elevations of the palace that he had built for his wife. He had many wives, but one favorite one, and the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. We do not have those preserved, but scholars think that those were a reality. You will please associate with this particular Neo-Babylonian king numerous biblical characters and prophecies. So the Hebrew Old Testament is replete with intersections with this story. Prophets like Ezekiel, Daniel, having grown up in the outskirts of the great capital of Babylon. Those are all Hebrew prophets, figures that are intersect with the Babylonian narrative. Babylon, the Neo-Babylonians destroy Nineveh in 612, but they are brought down themselves about 80 years later by the new gigantic empire that surfaces from further east called the Persians. And they will fall under Persian domination. Babylon will fall under the Persians in 539. Now we'll talk about the Persians in just a second, but number 5 are the Lydians. The Lydians are not a great military empire, even though in their own rights they will have an important presence. They are centered in a region that we call Turkey today, the nation of Turkey. In ancient times it was called Asia Minor. They had a significant contact with the most important culture we're heading to shortly, the Greeks in the Mediterranean Sea. They have a king that may be mythological, but maybe not, King Croesus. King Croesus is said to turned into gold anything he touched. That, of course, is a mythology, but it may indicate the importance of this culture in develop the currency, meaning instead of dragging a cow to the market to trade for 12 chickens, you can now use coins. See, please, example of Lydian coins in the image they have before you. This is a very important development because it creates a commodity-based economy. And also it starts elevating the value of precious metals such as gold and silver in the economy of the ancient world. The year 2002 recently saw the longest lasting currency disappear that was called the Greek drachma. It had been around, the Greek drachma, from about the 8th century before Christ, or the time of the Lydians, all the way to 2002, so throughout about 28 centuries. For 28 centuries, coins as a way to pay for things, so that you don't have to barter or trade, will be a significant. Of course, now we moved into the digital age, and coins are mattering less and less. But for 28 centuries, starting with the Lydians, we have the development of a currency-based system, coinage. Well, here's a quick map to show you, if you'll locate in this green map, where Lydia was. This is modern-day Turkey, but in ancient times there were all kinds of various kingdoms in this area. And again, remember that the Hittites owned nearly all of it, but the Lydians will be an important presence as they leave their mark on with currency and coinage, starting with the 8th century before Christ. Our last look at empires that appear and then disappear. Some stay around longer, like the Assyrians and the Persians. Others are barely a flash in the pan, like the Neo-Babylonians. The Persians are the last of our 6 empire builders. First mentioned in the 9th century by the Assyrians, that's when they first appear. They are a nomadic group, that is, they travel around, that come from the regions that are the Iranian plateau, so much further east than any of the people that we've looked at so far. They start uniting together from single individual tribes, and they start expanding, especially under a very important leader, king called Cyrus, who will go down as one of the many figures in history with the appellative of the Great. Cyrus the Great, around the time that the Neo-Babylonians and Nebuchadnezzar are in charge, they began expanding, especially in the area of Media, Lydia, and then, of course, in 539, Cyrus the Great will take Babylon, the capital of the Neo-Babylonians, and thus will begin the establishment of a huge empire. Please look at the map, find Babylon if you would, and other cities that are very important. There are the cities of Ecbatana, right in the middle of the map, Susa, right below that, and Persepolis, three major urban centers of the Persian Empire that will begin with Cyrus the Great at the end of the 6th century, so 539, and last until the 3rd century, so about the 3 centuries, the Persian Empire, and will expand all the way to the Indus River and even have strong influence over Palestine, Egypt, and even parts of Thrace. If you can find it, that's where Greece is, north of Athens. Quick look at the Persians. Cyrus will consolidate and allow for certain policies that are different than the Assyrians or the Babylonians. So in a sense, the Persians will be better dominators of the ancient world of that time. The Assyrians decapitated, the Babylonians deported, the Persians allow for people to go back home. They are more tolerant of religious differences. They are more macro managers rather than micromanagers. They don't care about as long as you keep the peace and don't question and pay taxes. We'll see that with the Romans as well. They will allow locals to govern themselves. They will allow locals to serve as officials in the various provinces that they will set up. They will encourage and foster a reputation as merciful overlords that don't decapitate and don't deport and allow you even to go home. So under the Persians, the Hebrews will have various contingents leave Babylon where they had been exiled and go back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple and the walls of Jerusalem. So the accounts that we have in the Bible of the Persians are fairly favorable because they allow the Hebrew people to go back home. There are other kings that will follow after Cyrus the Great, Cambyses, who will actually begin to deal the last blows to the long-lasting Egyptian culture by heading south and conquering parts of Egypt. Then will come another great leader and conqueror, Darius, Persian king that will invade the eastern parts of the world at the time, clear up to the Indus River of what we call the regions that we call India today. Major capitals of the Persian Empire will be the cities of Susa or Shusha and Persepolis. They will divide their massive kingdom into satrapies. A satrapy is governed by a satrap, and they will be very good at a bureaucratic organization of this very large empire. The satrap, excuse me, will function as kind of like miniature kings on their own under the big king that's in the capital of Susa and Persepolis. One of the greatest legacies of the Persians, besides policies that are more friendly to conquered people, is a massive road network. So this is one of the ways in which they will keep communication with far away, distant lands that they conquer, and will keep, you could say, them under their control as well, with a significant road network and a development of an international military, which means they allowed conquered people to serve in their military and their armies, thus creating a certain kind of loyalty to the Persian Empire by allowing people to fight with them and under them. A quick look at Persian religion. Originally, the Persians, of course, they are polytheistic like all ancient cultures except for the Hebrew people. Originally, they were very much nature worship. Of course, we've seen that in Mesopotamians and Egyptians as well. The Egyptians made a god out of the river, out of their alligators, their hippopotami, out of their insects. The Persians will originally have a very nature-oriented worship. Not only the sun, the earth, the wind, but other minor gods that are nature-oriented. One of the major gods that come out of the Persian landscape as they pop up on the scene of history for about 3 centuries, then are overrun by the Greeks, is the god Mithra. Mithra will be a god that will survive into the Roman culture significantly in the centuries to follow. The Roman legionnaires will adopt this Eastern Persian god Mithra as one of their favorites because of some characteristics about this god that are attractive to them. So we'll talk about that again when we come to the Romans. Interestingly enough, Zoroaster, that we believe lived in the 7th century, approximately before Christ, is another interesting figure. The worship of Zoroaster will lead some to speculate that for a brief time the Persians may have tried or attempted or gone monotheistic with the worship of a god called Ahura Mazda. But that is a theory more than it is proven. But for sure, the Persians will be polytheistic like all other ancient cultures. This concludes a quick look at empire builders.